Part 8, Missouri Irish, My Irish American Heritage, an oral history read and narrated by guest author Patricia Donahue O'Laughlin.
My Irish American Heritage. Ireland is the only country in the world to use a musical instrument as its national symbol. That instrument is the harp. Few Americans are aware of the fact that at one time harpists were executed in Ireland. This was done at a time in history when the British were trying to destroy the spirit and national pride of the Irish people. Their inherent musical prowess could not be destroyed. Many have commented on the remarkable resiliency of the Irish people, of their ability to accept the hardships inflicted upon them without letting it destroy their spirit. Faith in God, a sense of humor, and their music often enabled them to be survivors. Irish immigrants brought their musical aptitude, their creativity, and the ability to dream great dreams to their adopted land. In the isolation of the American frontier, rugged farmers, railroad workers, miners, and mountain men created their own entertainment by singing and dancing, and by playing the tin whistle, the flute, and the fiddle. They didn't have much money and often used handcrafted instruments. The tunes they played were old Irish traditional tunes they had recorded by memory. They had been prevented for centuries by English law from keeping written records in Ireland. Yankee Doodle, the popular song of the American Revolution, was one such song. Dixie, Maryland, My Maryland, Danny Boy, and Wearing of the Green were some of the others. The large numbers of Irish-born immigrating to Missouri from the South and East brought the new lyrics with them. Irishmen loved to sing. Those who didn't play an instrument participated in frequent sing-alongs. Their ballads always told a story, and the lyrics were as important as the melody. Fiddling contests were popular, and they had a talent for spinning a yarn and the telling of tall tales. These social activities were very rewarding, and they didn't cost anything. Irish immigrants placed a high value on human life and relationships. In their adopted country, old customs were continued. Weddings, baptisms, and funerals were occasions for the gathering of the clan. Family members often traveled great distances to attend these functions, which offered opportunities to renew old ties and strengthen bonds between them. The families I will introduce to you in this chapter were especially gifted. They produced in future generations in America successful musicians, teachers, doctors, nurses, lawyers, politicians, scientists, journalists, farmers, business leaders, priests, nuns, and a Jesuit missionary to India who created a self-supporting village for the natives there. These were my people. Cork beginnings. In the little town of Coachford in County Cork, Ireland, 4 young brothers and their uncle left home in 1851 to begin a long journey to a new world and a new life. Michael Buckley, born in 1822, was 29 years old, and John T. Buckley, born in 1830, was 21. The other brothers were Timothy and Patrick. The uncle, James Buckley, accompanied 3 of them on a boat trip to New York and continued his trip to Australia by way of New Orleans. The boys parted with their uncle in New York and never heard from him again. Michael was separated from Timothy and Patrick in New York and continued to Louisville, Kentucky alone. The other 2 brothers stayed together and settled in Iowa, where they both raised large families. John, the 4th brother, went to Liverpool, England, to say goodbye to his girlfriend before making the trip to America. He left Liverpool on the Eastern Queen and arrived in New Orleans on July 5, 1851. He worked there as a grocer for a time, married a Southern girl, and moved to Louisville to be near his brother Michael. While living there, he worked on the railroad. His young wife died of cholera and left him with 1 child, an infant girl. John took the infant on foot to St. Louis, Missouri, where he left her temporarily in an orphanage to be cared for. When he returned for the child, she had disappeared. When told that she had died, he didn't believe it and continued to look for her. No trace was ever found of the child. John T. Buckley was my mother's maternal grandfather. She was 9 years old when he died in 1906 and told stories of having seen him rocking in a rocking chair as an elderly man crying as he talked of his search for his little girl. He never stopped grieving for her. In 1855, John's brother Michael traveled to St. Louis, Missouri from Iowa, where he had been a railroad contractor. He then constructed the first street railway in St. Louis and contracted to build grade the first racetrack on the old fairgrounds there. In addition to other construction works, he built 7 miles of railroad track out of Brownsville and completed jobs in Leavenworth, Kansas, and Lexington, Missouri. In 1857, he was married in Burlington, Iowa, to Mary Mullen, also from County Cork, Ireland. In 1859, when Father Hogan was establishing the Irish wilderness, a daughter was born to them in Iowa. An infant son had been buried earlier in St. Louis. 2 sons were born in Shackelford, Missouri, Timothy in 1860 and Michael in 1862. In following the railroad, as many of their contemporaries did, they had lived in many places in a short period of time. During this period, John had married Mary Elizabeth Higgins Maroney, a widow with a small son, John, and his wife, Bess, settled on a farm near Dresden, Missouri. Their first son, Timothy, was born in 1862. Now the nation was involved in civil war, which had started at Sumter, Virginia, on April 13, 1861. Michael disposed of his construction equipment and in 1863 also settled on a farm near Dresden. He became a successful farmer and stockman. At the time of his death in 1882, he owned 630 acres of land upon which he had made extensive improvements. On the neighboring farm, John's wife, Bess, had given birth to 4 more sons, John, Patrick, Daniel, James, and 2 daughters, Mary Ellen and Josephine, in the years between 1865 and 1878. The war had ended in 1865. Missouri was a border state, and the war years had not been easy for Irish farmers in Missouri. Men from both sides went into uniforms of blue and gray to disguise their acts of murder and plunder. During the war, groups of guerrillas often camped near Dresden, Missouri. Nearby Sedalia was the terminus of the railroad, and most of the contractors and workers were Irish immigrants. In 1861, it became a military post, and Union General Nathaniel Lyon camped there with his army of men. The first passenger train arrived in the city on January 17, 1861, and the first few houses were built that year. Prior to that time, portable railroad houses were moved by rail from towns that had flourished temporarily as the railroad moved westward through Missouri. Buildings and houses were also torn down and brought by wagons to be rebuilt in new towns as they were created. 20 days before the Confederate General Price reached Sedalia on his march across Missouri in 1863, citizens were warned that there would be wandering bands of bushwhackers committing deeds of violence in the area. Forewarned, the people buried valuables for safety. In those days, many found out the hard way that it was safer for a woman to answer the door than for a man to do so. On one occasion, a regiment of men came to John Buckley's home and demanded the use of their house and food for the men of the regiment. Bess had answered the knock on the door, and since the Confederate soldier making the request was smaller than she was, she picked him up and threw him into the yard with a good bit of force. He picked himself up, and as the men quickly rode away, she overheard one of them say, "Never go to that door again." They didn't. Bess's daughters were 14 and 16 years old when she died in 1892. Two of her sons, John and James, went to California to work for the railroads. Mary Ellen, born in 1876, was underage and received her father's written consent in 1894 to marry Michael Francis Sullivan. Michael's father, Dennis Sullivan, came from County Kerry, Ireland, and had traveled from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, to St. Louis in a covered wagon after his marriage in 1856. Michael and Mary Ellen Sullivan were blessed with a family of 4 children before he was killed in a tragic railroad accident in 1902. On the day preceding the accident, John Buckley deeded his farm in Dresden to his son in preparation for making his home with his daughter, Mary Ellen, in Jefferson City, Missouri. Upon the sudden death of her husband, Mary Ellen returned to Sedalia and converted her home into a rooming house in order to support her family. When her oldest daughter, Mary Elizabeth, had graduated from high school, the family moved to St. Louis, where there were more opportunities for employment than there had been in the small city. On a Monday afternoon in 1906, Irish-born John T. Buckley died at the home of his youngest daughter, Josephine. He had lived 45 years in America. He was buried in the Sedalia Cemetery, not far from his brother Michael, who had died in 1882. Pettis County, Missouri records state that Irish-born Michael Buckley's children were educated in district schools, supplemented by private instruction from their father, who was an unusually well-educated man and an excellent mathematician. His oldest son, Timothy, continued to live at home until his father's death in 1882, when he and his brothers continued to operate the family farm. In the spring of 1895, he and his brother Michael purchased a 450-acre farm. 240 acres went to Michael, and 210 acres went to Timothy. There were very few improvements on the place when they bought it. Michael first lived there in a canvas house while he dug a well and built a smokehouse. Later, he built a 14-room modern residence with electric lights and heating system and hot water. He also built a silo, 2 large barns, and landscaped the place with trees to be enjoyed by generations to come. In 1897, at the age of 35, he married Lucretia Thompson. Their 6 children were raised on the farm in Missouri, which was called Valley View Farm. He became a very successful breeder of shorthorn cattle and Poland China hogs. Timothy Buckley also made extensive improvements on his place, called Woodside Stock Farm. In addition to his agricultural interests, he was a stockholder and vice president of Farmers State Bank from its inception. He was also one of the first directors of the Farmers Mutual Insurance Company. In 1890, he married Ellen Connor, daughter of John Connor, a prominent Pettis County pioneer. 2 of their 5 children served in the United States in World War I. Subsequent generations had a tendency to leave the farms of their parents had worked so hard to develop. One reason for this was their high regard for education, which was more readily available in the city. Education enabled them to develop new skills, which brought opportunities to enter new fields of endeavor in a fast-changing world. Beginning in the late 1860s, American farmers entered a long period of depression, which with brief respites lasted until the end of the century. In the early years, the Irish-born and first-generation American-born often stayed on the farm, working together from early morn till late at night. The work was hard. When not helping at home, they got the only formal education available to them in small area schools. When children went away to school, their labor was no longer available to help keep the farm going. The Civil War and World War I took many sons away from their parents who needed their help on small family farms. Having been exposed to a new way of life in the city, many chose not to return to the old way of life after the wars had ended. The availability of work on the railroads and the security of a regular paycheck lured many away from unpredictable futures on family farms. The Irish possessed many qualities needed by the rapidly growing railroad industry. Together, they opened the gateway to the West. In the Sedalia Cemetery, 2 tombstones stand side by side. One reads Dennis Sullivan, 1830-1915. The other carries the name of Mary Reedy Sullivan, 1842-1922. Dennis Sullivan was born in County Kerry, Ireland. He was married to 14-year-old Mary Reedy at St. Paul's Cathedral in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, on March 25, 1856. Her marriage certificate states that she came from Ireland. She and a brother John, living in Meridian, Mississippi, were the children of General Reedy of the British Army. Family legend states that a wagon load of gold her father had deposited for her with the Chancellery of the Court of England was lost in shipment to her during the Civil War. She never received it. Dennis and Mary Sullivan crossed the country in a covered wagon en route to St. Louis. He served on the side of the Union in the Civil War and helped construct the Eads Bridge across the Mississippi at St. Louis. Construction of the bridge began in 1867 and continued until 1874. Its lower deck for rail traffic provided competition for the ferries, which had been the main transportation into St. Louis. The Sullivans settled on a farm at Syracuse, Missouri, raising their family of 12 children. One daughter, Mary, died in infancy. The other daughter, Veronica, was a musician. One of her published works for the piano was 20th Century March. It was customary among the Irish to share musical knowledge among members of a family, handing it down orally from generation to generation. It was Veronica who taught my mother and her sisters to play the piano. The 10 Sullivan brothers raised on the farm at Syracuse were Benjamin, Maurice, Patrick, Michael, John, Nicholas, William, Joseph, Leo, and Humphrey. All of them became railroad men. In later years, Dennis retired from the farm and lived in nearby Sedalia, Missouri. He was my mother's paternal grandfather. She often said he reminded her of Santa Claus and once wrote, "I remember him as a very quiet, dignified old man with a long white beard. One of my memories of him is standing by the big range in my grandmother's kitchen, playing the flute. I also remember the good things, pies, cakes, and cookies that came from the big wood-burning range in grandmother's kitchen." It is customary for the Irish to name a son after his father or grandfather, thus repeating the same names for generations. This practice often helps and sometimes confuses the genealogist. Dennis Sullivan's son Patrick married Catherine Rockford, and in 1910 moved with his family from Syracuse to St. Louis. Their son Patrick was Judge Patrick J. Sullivan of St. Louis. Patrick had another son named John Berkman Sullivan, born March 10, 1897, who served 4 terms as a representative of the state of Missouri in the United States Congress. John B., as he was called, had enlisted and served as a private in the infantry during World War I. Elected as a Democrat to the 77th Congress, he served his first term from January 3, 1941 to January 3, 1943. These were the early days of World War II. A fellow congressman and friend, Harry S. Truman, then a U.S. Senator, became the first Missourian to serve as president. John B. was elected 3 more times to Congress and last served in the 82nd Congress from January 3, 1949 until his death in 1951. News releases in the Washington, D.C. papers at that time referred to Sullivan as a man from a family that was a part of transportation's growth westward from the days of the earliest railroad west of the Mississippi. The reference was to the Missouri Pacific Railroad, that had its first locomotive run on a 5-mile trip from St. Louis in 1852. The Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad, now part of the Burlington system, reached the Missouri River in 1859. The transcontinental lines were the most important factor in making the United States a truly united nation. After John B. Sullivan's death in 1951 at the age of 54, he was succeeded in Congress by his wife, Lenore K. Sullivan. She was the first woman elected to Congress from the state of Missouri. Michael, another son of Dennis and Mary Rita Sullivan, was born in 1870. He married Mary Ellen Buckley in 1894. He had been a railroad engineer for the Missouri Pacific Railroad and was promoted to the position of conductor just 3 months before he was killed on November 24, 1902. While backing up 50 empty railroad cars on the river route, steam engine number 1227 of train number 72 toppled over 1 mile west of Lake City, Missouri, killing Michael, the conductor, and Doherty, the fireman. The engineer was not injured. Newspaper accounts on the day following the accident stated, "The engine toppled over and went into the ditch, followed by 12 of the empty coal cars. Conductor Sullivan was riding on the engine and was buried beneath the mass of iron. The crew labored heroically to save Doherty, who had fractured both legs and was badly burned. He was under the engine from 7:35 until 10 o'clock p.m., while it was 20 minutes after midnight before the body of the conductor Sullivan was gotten out." And speaking of Mike Sullivan, the article stated, "No more popular railroad employee ever resided within the corporate limits of the city." The record book Michael was carrying at the time of the accident was recovered and kept by his family. The last entry he had recorded was that of the delivery of 50 coal cars on November 24, 1902. He was only 32 years old at the time of his death. His wife, Mary Ellen Buckley, was 26 and left with 3 young daughters and a son to raise. Railroad officials had offered her a very small settlement with the admonition that she accept their offer on the spot, or her dead husband's 9 brothers who worked for the same line would be terminated. She accepted the offer in a state of shock. With the passage of time and a positive outlook on life, one tends to remember only the good things. Mary Ellen possessed the high ideals and personal pride so often found in the Irish, and she managed to create a new life for herself and her family. Michael Sullivan was a member of the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen, Prairie Queen Division number 18. The railroads were among the first American industries to become unionized, but abuses continued after unionization. The railroads were interested in economics and not in the welfare of the worker. Intimidation was frequently used, and because of the scarcity of jobs, workers were often forced to make the best of unpleasant situations. The Missouri Pacific Railroad informed me in 1982 that they kept no employee records of anyone born before the year 1900. It was these early workers that enabled the railroads to become the giants of transportation they later became. The men who built the rails and operated the machines that rolled it over them deserve credit for civilizing the western frontier. Railroad building started before the Civil War, slowed during the conflict, and after the war, production was speeded up with the most vigorous growth occurring in the 1880s. In attempts to establish employee unions, there were violent and bloody strikes in 1877 and 1894. At first, regulation was handled by the state and was purely local in nature. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act placed the rails under federal legislation. The growth of Missouri was linked to the railroads and their transportation of cattle, coal, and grain throughout the nation. After the Civil War, land grants from the United States government in return for railroad reduced rates for government traffic enabled the railroads to push further westward. The prairies and mountains were still undeveloped and sparsely settled in the state of Missouri. This provided employment opportunities for discouraged Irish farmers whose crops and homes had been confiscated or destroyed during the war. Tired also of being so dependent on the unpredictable weather, many young Irishmen were ready to make new beginnings. A clipping from a Sedalia newspaper recounts the reminiscing of Tom Buckley, who recalled the winters of 1885 and 1886 when snow covered the ground in the month of May in Missouri. On May 1st, 1885, it snowed all the way from Fort Scott, Kansas to Clinton, Missouri, and when the train on which he was riding pulled into Appleton City, there was a full half-inch of snow on the platform at the depot. Plant life was frozen, and all gardens and crops had to be planted the last of May and in June. On May 6, 1886, there was a blinding snowstorm for 2 hours, from 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. He was plowing and had to stop because of the snow. Every Irishman dreams of owning a little bit of land. Many early railroad workers in Missouri left farms to take jobs offering the security of a regular paycheck. Many planned to work at these jobs only until they had accomplished enough money to buy their own parcel of land. A camaraderie existed among Irish workers, especially in Missouri, where many, like the Sullivan brothers, members of large families, had grown up on large family farms where they had learned to work together well. This teamwork was advantageous to the rapidly developing railroad industry, as were the decision-making skills and other talents of the proud and independent Irish. These farmers were physically strong and accustomed to hard work. Michael Sullivan's oldest daughter, Mary Elizabeth, was 7 years old at the time of her father's fatal accident. She married Stephen Francis Donahue on September 27, 1916. Their marriage in St. Louis marked the union of two ancient Irish families, the O'Donohues and the Sullivans, whose ancestors are buried together in the ruins of Muckross Abbey in Killarney, Ireland. The Donahues had come to Missouri from County Kerry, Ireland in 1856, leaving behind the ruins of Keliher Castle, the seat of the O'Donohues of the Glen. Ross Castle, located in nearby Killarney, was also once a Donahue stronghold. Both castles were destroyed during the Cromwellian invasions in 1653. In Ireland, this family had reacted to the intimidation with rebellion. The allegiance that England had tried to unsuccessfully force from them, they frequently gave to America. The children were not allowed by their Irish-born father to speak Gaelic in their home in Missouri. He felt that speaking the language of their new country would help them start a new life. His words to his children were, "We came to this country to begin a new life. We can't expect the people here to speak our language." In Ireland, the Gaelic language was outlawed by the English. The Irish had struggled to keep this part of their ancient culture alive by defiantly speaking it in secret and teaching it to their children by word of mouth. It was seldom written. These people also had the ability to look ahead with a positive attitude, proudly aware of who they were and where they had come from. Their energies were concentrated on where they were going and on their hopes for the future. The Irish immigrant had the advantage of speaking the English language upon arrival in America. Michael Donahue, son of Cornelius O'Donoghue and Mary Kelliher of Glenflesk, Ireland, came to America accompanied by his brother Daniel in 1856 at the age of 19. Daniel, who was 23 at the time, settled in Tipton, Missouri. He married and raised 3 sons there. They were Michael, Patrick, and Peter. His son Michael settled on a farm in Spring Fork, Missouri, where he and his wife, Mary Sheehan, operated the general store and post office. Other brothers of Irish-born Daniel and Michael settling in Missouri in the 1850s were Jeremiah in Lynn, Cornelius in Lamar, and Patrick in St. Louis. Their father, Cornelius, made his home with his oldest son, Jeremiah. Their mother, Mary Keliher, never left Ireland. A sister, Peg, met and married a blacksmith in Lynn, where she had lived with her father and older brother. I have referred to the custom of the repetitive use of names in Irish families. This applied to both men and women. Daughters were often named after their mother, with the firstborn frequently being called Mary. With so many Marys in a family, it became necessary to include a second name, such as Mary Elizabeth, Mary Ellen, or Mary Patricia. At baptism, Irish Catholics choose the name of a saint, whose life is to serve as an inspiration to the one taking the name. The more popular Irish saints, such as Bridget and Patrick, were used often by the Irish because they were familiar with the details of their lives and could relate to them as models. Mary was well known as the mother of Christ, and Joseph was the head of the Holy Family. It is interesting to note that in the Buckley family, previously mentioned, both Irish-born brothers, Michael and John T., named their firstborn sons Timothy J. One of the two brothers who left Ireland with them in 1851 was Timothy. It is probable that their father had the same name, since it was used with such frequency by widely separated family members. Irish-born Michael Donahue landed at New Orleans, Louisiana in 1856 on a ship that had been scheduled to arrive in New York. Because of disease that broke out on the ship after departure from Ireland, it was denied admittance in New York and forced to proceed to New Orleans harbor. This was a common occurrence with immigrant ships arriving in America in the 19th century. Michael worked his way across the country to Missouri on the railroad. After reaching Missouri, he engineered the construction of the Missouri Pacific Railway between Tipton and Sedalia. The railroads in this country were not designed as one huge system. They were constructed in small segments by small companies. At first, they connected one small town with another. They eventually merged with larger routes, forming a well-coordinated network across the nation. The first railway in Ireland was opened with a short run between Dublin and Donhaue in 1834. Michael Donahue, born at Glenflesk, Ireland, 2 years later, may have gained a knowledge of railroad building before he arrived in America. In the process of constructing the rail line to Tipton, he married Mary Fitzgerald and raised 3 sons there, living in the same town as his brother Daniel and his family. His sons were Patrick, Cornelius, and Michael. Cornelius is remembered as having been very adept at playing the fiddle. After Mary Fitzgerald died, he married Mary Miller, who died after just 1 year of marriage, leaving him with an infant daughter. He settled then in Sedalia, living first in the Irish area on 3rd Street called the Kerry Patch. As soon as he could save enough money, he bought a 10-acre tract of land just outside of Sedalia on Highway 45. He then purchased a farm at Syracuse, Missouri, where he lived with his third wife, Adeline Rebecca Llewellyn, whom he married in 1881. He was 45 years of age and she was 20. Their 5 surviving children, born at the farm, were Thomas, Elizabeth, Robert, Emmert, Stephen, and Margaret. They lived in the same area that had been settled earlier by the Irish-born Buckleys and Dennis Sullivan. 8 of Michael's children died of pneumonia. Before the advent of penicillin and other miracle drugs and the routine use of vaccinations, many families lost children to pneumonia, tuberculosis, smallpox, and other contagious diseases. Infants, teenagers, and young adults were stricken with fatal diseases that often claimed the lives of more than one member of a family. Irish-born Michael Donahue died in 1901 at the age of 65. By this time, the frontier had vanished. The Donahue family left the farm and moved to Sedalia in 1902, where the 2 youngest children, Stephen, born in 1892, and Margaret, born in 1900, were educated. Elizabeth became a schoolteacher. Thomas and Emmett attended trade schools and entered other professions. Margaret taught school until her marriage to Joseph W. Murphy, a veteran of World War I, and later U.S. Deputy Marshal. After living for a time in Sedalia, they moved to Kansas City, where they raised their family of 13 children. He died on St. Patrick's Day, March 17, 1982. Margaret was a musician and an organist at Redemptorist Catholic Church in Kansas City, where she played the organ well into the 80s. When Adeline Rebecca Llewellyn married Irish-born Michael Donahue, she converted to Catholicism, choosing the baptismal name of Mary. His first two wives had also been named Mary. As previously stated, their youngest son, Stephen Francis Donahue, married Mary Elizabeth Sullivan in 1916. She was the daughter of Michael and Mary Ellen Sullivan. They were my parents. After their marriage in St. Louis, they settled in Kansas City, where he was a telegrapher with the Western Union Telegraph Company. He began his career with Western Union in 1907 at the age of 15. Steve shared his father's desire to own land. In 1936, he purchased a 40-acre farm near Blue Springs, Missouri, and commuted to his job in the city. His large family of 6 boys and 6 girls spent the long, hot Missouri summers in the healthy and wholesome atmosphere of the country. They were exposed to a different way of life there than they had known in the city, where they lived the rest of the year. Steve and Bess Donahue's 12 children were all born and raised in Kansas City, Missouri, where they were educated in parochial schools and had access to higher education. At the time of his death of a heart attack in 1942, at the age of 49, he was Western Union Wire Chief in Kansas City. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, contributing to the phenomenal growth of an extraordinary nation. These families were typical examples of the thousands that came to the state of Missouri from Ireland in the 19th century. Having been exposed to many close relationships as members of large, close-knit families, they often had an instinct about people and performed well in areas that required direct communication. They found their way into all areas of life. Their high ideals and Christian ethics blended well with the American ideal of liberty and justice for all.
You have reached the end of our 8-part audio edition of Missouri Irish. This work is based upon the original hard copy book of the same title by author Michael C. O'Laughlin. Additional audio programs are available at www.irishroots.com. Another lesson from the Irish Hedgerow. Copyright 2010 from the Irish Roots Cafe and irishroots.com. Thank you.